Waitress's insult to Clint Eastwood backfires in the most unexpected way. What happened next will leave you speechless. The dimly lit diner on the corner of Main Street was a far cry from the glamorous movie sets Clint Eastwood had graced throughout his legendary career. But for Clint, it was just another stop in his journey. He had always prided himself on being a man of the people, unpretentious and grounded despite his fame and success. That evening, he was simply a man in search of a good meal. As he slid into a booth near the window, Clint's weathered face remained calm, his piercing blue eyes scanning the menu. He wasn't one to draw attention to himself, preferring the quiet anonymity that came with being out of the public eye. But this evening, things were about to take a turn. The waitress, a young woman in her early 20s, was quick to approach his table, her uniform slightly wrinkled, and her hair tied back in a messy ponytail. She didn't recognize him at first. Clint had long since stopped being the figurehead of the younger generation's cinematic idol. But what she did recognize was the opportunity to show off her quick wit. And in her world, that meant speaking her mind, no matter who the customer was. What can I get you?" she asked, tapping her pen against her notepad. Clint looked up, offering a small, friendly smile. "I'll have the soup of the day, please." "Soup of the day? Huh," she said with a slight smirk, glancing at him curiously. "Sure, that's fitting. Someone like you probably doesn't mind a meal that's a little bland. Huh? You don't really strike me as someone who knows what good food tastes like." Clint's smile faded slightly, but he didn't respond right away. He simply looked at her, his calm gaze never wavering. He'd been in enough situations, on and off the set, to understand the kind of person who would test boundaries just for the sake of it. The waitress's insult was unnecessary, but he chose to let it slide. At least, that was until the waitress, emboldened by his silence, pushed further. "Hey, aren't you that old guy from those Western movies? Clint Eastwood, right? It must be hard for you to get people to take you seriously anymore. I mean, really, who's still watching old Westerns?" she said with a laugh, clearly amused at her own joke. The word stung, though Clint never showed it. He was no stranger to criticism, especially from people who didn't understand his work. But this was different. This was more than just a casual jab. It was disrespect. And it wasn't just directed at him. It was an insult to his entire career, to the countless hours he had spent honing his craft, to the characters he had brought to life, to the millions of fans who had supported him through the years. Clint's fingers tapped lightly on the edge of the table, a sign that his patience was wearing thin. But instead of launching into a tirade, he leaned back in his booth, his expression still stoic. "You know," Clint said, his gravelly voice cutting through the air with a calm intensity, "I've been doing this for longer than you've probably been alive. I don't need to prove myself to anyone, especially not to a waitress who thinks making jokes at other people's expense is the way to get attention." The young woman was taken aback by his response, but she quickly recovered. She had grown up hearing about celebrities who couldn't handle a bit of teasing. Surely, Clint Eastwood would be no different. So, she laughed again, this time louder, trying to brush off his words. "You really think your little insults are going to hurt me? You're just another washed-up actor, Clint. Do you even know what it's like to work a real job? To hustle every day just to make ends meet?" She tossed her pen on the counter and crossed her arms over her chest. Clint studied her for a moment, sensing her anger and insecurity, and then gave a slight shake of his head. There was no malice in his expression, only a quiet understanding. He wasn't angry. He simply wasn't going to stand by while she continued to disrespect him. "You want to talk about hard work? You don't know the first thing about hard work or respect. But you'll learn," he said, his tone cool but firm. As Clint finished his sentence, he noticed a man in the back corner of the diner watching intently. The man, well-dressed and carrying an air of quiet authority, stood up and approached the counter, his eyes locked on the waitress. "Excuse me, miss," he said, his voice calm but authoritative. "I overheard your conversation, and I'm afraid I have to disagree with you. Clint Eastwood has done more for this industry and this country than you could ever understand. You do well to show some respect, not just to him, but to everyone you serve." The waitress blinked, taken aback by the stranger's words. "What do you mean?" she stammered. The man smiled, pulling out his business card and placing it on the counter. I'm the head of a major film studio, and I think Clint deserves more than an insult from someone who doesn't even recognize the legend sitting in front of her. Maybe it's time for a new job for you." The room went silent as the realization hit the waitress. She had just insulted Clint Eastwood, and in doing so, she had lost her job. Clint looked at her one last time, his eyes softening slightly, but his words were still firm. "I hope you learn the value of respect. And the next time you're lucky enough to serve someone who's had a little more life experience than you, maybe keep that in mind." The waitress, now humiliated, stood frozen in place as the man handed her a formal letter from the restaurant's management. She had lost everything in a single moment: her pride, her job, and her dignity. Clint Eastwood didn't wait around to see her reaction. He stood up, collected his things, and walked out of the diner, his back straight and his head held high. He had never needed to prove anything to anyone. He was Clint Eastwood, and he just taught a lesson in humility. The incident in the diner had rippled through the small town like a stone thrown into still water. Word of the waitress's reckless behavior spread quickly as local diners and cafe patrons exchanged the story in hushed voices. But the tale didn't remain confined to the small town for long. In the age of social media, every event, whether monumental or seemingly insignificant, was just one viral post away from reaching the masses. By the time Clint Eastwood returned to his hotel room, the story had exploded online. News outlets, fan pages, and entertainment blogs picked up the incident, framing it as a classic example of celebrity humility clashing with youthful arrogance. But while some mocked the waitress's actions, others stood behind Clint's response, hailing him as a symbol of grace under pressure. Even more shocking to the young waitress, a video of the exchange had surfaced. A passerby who had been filming the interaction on their phone uploaded it to social media, and within hours it had gone viral. The video, capturing Clint's calm demeanor and the waitress's escalating insults, was shared across multiple platforms. With millions of views within the first 24 hours, the story spread across the nation. Clint had become a hero in the eyes of many, proving that even in his later years, he still held the moral high ground. While Clint remained unfazed by the media attention, the waitress, whose name was Emily, found herself at the center of a public relations nightmare. The small-town girl who had mocked one of Hollywood's most legendary figures had suddenly found herself facing the consequences of her words. The diner's owner, Tom Reynolds, had been reluctant to take immediate action, but the mounting pressure from customers, social media, and his business partners made it impossible to ignore. After a tense meeting with the restaurant's management team, Tom made a difficult decision. Emily was called into the office the next day. As she walked through the kitchen doors, the weight of the situation sank in. Tom, his face grim, was sitting behind a desk stacked with papers. "Have a seat, Emily," Tom said, his voice cold. He didn't even look up as she sat down. She shifted nervously in her seat, avoiding eye contact. "I know what you're going to say," she muttered, her voice trembling. "I didn't mean it to get this far, but—" Tom raised his hand, silencing her. "You don't get it, do you? You've humiliated one of the most respected people in Hollywood. Someone who built his career with dignity and respect for his fans. And now, you've turned it into a joke." Emily's face flushed as the realization of her actions hit her harder than ever. The stories she had heard, the memes and mocking comments online, they were all true. She had thrown away her career for the sake of a careless, impulsive comment. "You're fired," Tom said bluntly, setting the letter of termination in front of her. Emily stared at it in disbelief, unable to comprehend what had just been said. "Is this really happening?" she whispered. Tom nodded. "You're lucky the press hasn't reached us here yet. But you've put us in a position we can't come back from. I can't keep you here, and I can't risk more bad publicity. You're done." Emily sat there in stunned silence. Everything she had worked for, the job, the small circle of friends, the sense of purpose, was slipping through her fingers. And it was all her fault. She had been so quick to try and make a name for herself at Clint Eastwood's expense, but the cost was far greater than she had anticipated. As she left the diner that day, her stomach churned with regret. The weight of her actions would follow her, perhaps for the rest of her life. The moment she had chosen to insult Clint Eastwood would be the defining one, the one that ended her career in a small-town restaurant and set the course for the future. But little did she know, her story was far from over. The media's focus on the incident had not only brought Clint's legendary status back into the spotlight, but it had also brought her, Emily, to the center of a viral storm. The attention on her was far more intense than she could have imagined. While she might have hoped the incident would fade into obscurity, the relentless power of social media had ensured that she would be remembered, not for her work or accomplishments, but for the moment she had insulted one of the most iconic figures in Hollywood. Back in the quiet of his hotel room, Clint Eastwood read the headlines with a slight smile. The waitress had, in some ways, become a part of his legacy. One more story that would be told, one more lesson learned in the grand narrative of his life. As he set his phone down, he couldn't help but think about the younger generation. They often had so much to learn, but sometimes it took the right moment to reveal the lesson. He had not only outwitted a brash young waitress, but he had also reminded the world of the value of respect, humility, and grace. As for Emily, the lesson was harder learned. With nowhere to turn, and no one left to defend her actions, she was left to reflect on the bitterness of her words, which had cost her far more than she ever anticipated. As the weeks passed, the effects of Emily's outburst continued to echo through both her life and Clint Eastwood's. What had initially been a fleeting moment of arrogance had turned into a life-altering chain of events. Emily, once a waitress with big dreams in a small town, now found herself jobless and vilified by an entire community. The viral nature of the incident ensured that her mistake followed her wherever she went. Even at her new, less glamorous job in a different town, people couldn't forget the viral video that had defined her in the eyes of the public. As for Clint, the incident only further solidified his place in the hearts of many. While he had initially seen the whole episode as nothing more than a brief moment in his long career, the attention it garnered allowed Clint to reflect on his legacy and the power of silence. He didn't need to lash out or seek revenge. His calm response, his dignified silence, spoke volumes. It was a lesson in humility, one that resonated with his fans and detractors alike. Emily, meanwhile, was forced to confront the consequences of her actions. A chance encounter one evening changed her life forever. She had moved to a new town in the hopes of starting over, far away from the embarrassment of her past. But one day, while walking to the local grocery store, she spotted a familiar face sitting at the corner of the cafe, a face that still haunted her every waking moment. Clint Eastwood was sitting alone, sipping coffee and reading the newspaper. His expression was calm, but his presence in the small-town cafe was unmistakable. As Emily approached the counter, she hesitated, unable to decide whether to approach him. It was an odd coincidence. She hadn't expected to see him here, far from the spotlight, in a place as quiet as this. But it wasn't just a coincidence. It was a moment of reckoning. She stood there for a moment, staring at him from a distance, before finally walking up to the counter. With a deep breath, she summoned the courage to speak. "Mr. Eastwood?" she said, her voice trembling. Clint looked up, his piercing eyes meeting hers. There was a moment of silence, then a brief nod. "Yes." Clint responded, his voice measured, as calm as it had been in the diner. There was no trace of malice or anger in his demeanor, only that familiar air of quiet confidence. I just wanted to say I'm sorry," Emily said, her voice barely above a whisper. "For what happened? For how I treated you that day. I was rude, and I didn't mean for any of this to happen." Clint set his newspaper down, his gaze unwavering. For a moment, Emily feared he might say something dismissive, that he might ignore her or simply walk away. But instead, he spoke in the same calm, composed manner that had made him a legendary figure. "Young lady," Clint said, his voice low but full of wisdom, "we all make mistakes. It's how we handle them that counts. You've learned a lesson that many people take years to understand. Life isn't about trying to tear others down to build yourself up. It's about respect, and it's never too late to start fresh." Emily stood there, stunned by his words. She had expected the anger, the bitter resentment, but instead, she was met with understanding and kindness. His words weren't just an apology for the incident. It was a life lesson, one that would stay with her forever. "I know it's not much, but I wanted to apologize in person," she said, feeling a wave of relief wash over her. Clint nodded, as if acknowledging her sincerity. "You've got a chance to do better," Clint replied, his eyes softening slightly. "But remember, it's not the past that defines you. It's what you do next." With that, Clint picked up his coffee and returned to his newspaper, signaling that the conversation was over. But for Emily, it wasn't over. It was the beginning of something new, an understanding that the mistake she had made could be redeemed, and that the respect she had once dismissed was now something she would work hard to earn. For Clint, the encounter was a reminder of the power of grace. He didn't need to seek revenge or make a spectacle of the situation. His silence, his quiet dignity, had been the most powerful response of all. In that moment, Clint Eastwood had not only taught a young waitress a valuable lesson, he had shown the world that sometimes the greatest strength lies in restraint. As Emily left the cafe, a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. The lesson she had learned from Clint wasn't just about humility, it was about redemption. She had a chance to rebuild her life, to become someone who respected others as they deserved to be respected. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but at least now she understood that the path to redemption began with a single, simple act, acknowledging your mistakes and choosing to do better. And as Clint Eastwood sipped his coffee, his legacy had grown just a little bit stronger. Not because of the accolades or the awards, but because of his unwavering belief in the power of humility, even in the face of insult.